Welcome back to the autonomic nervous system. In this video, we'd like to answer the question written here. In other words, in the sympathetic nervous system, where are the preganglionic cell bodies located anatomically? Here's our scheme of the sympathetic nervous system. We have the preganglionic neuron, which synapses on to the postganglionic neuron within one of the sympathetic ganglia. The second neuron continues its axon all the way to a synapse onto the target tissue. So by definition, all of the postganglionic cell bodies are located within ganglia. And as we've already discussed, when we're talking about ganglia within the sympathetic nervous system, we know that all of these postganglionic cell bodies will be located in sympathetic ganglia, which fall into two main categories, either the sympathetic chain ganglia, which are also called the paravertebral ganglia, or the other place where you could find sympathetic ganglia is a prevertebral or pre-aortic ganglia. What we're going to do today is we're going to walk backwards along the sympathetic nervous system and address the question, where are these preganglionic or presynaptic sympathetic cell bodies located within the body? So let's get to work addressing the question, where are the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies? As is the case in both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, the location of the first or presynaptic or preganglionic neuron is always within the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So we already know that the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies must be located within the central nervous system. And we know that the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the good news for us is that in the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic cell bodies are all located within the spinal cord. So we do not have to worry about the brain when we're talking about the location of the preganglionic or presynaptic or first neurons within the sympathetic nervous system. They're all located within the spinal cord. So now our question is, where within the spinal cord are these presynaptic or preganglionic or first neurons of the sympathetic nervous system located? So let's take a quick look in a gross anatomy sort of way at the spinal cord, with at the top being the superior portion and at the bottom being the inferior portion of the spinal cord. So the upper regions or superior regions of the spinal cord are called cervical because they control the spinal nerves that run out into the neck region. And of course, it's always good to remember that another thing coming off the cervical region of the cord is the phrenic nerve. Now this is just an aside, but the phrenic nerve, which consists of the roots C, 3, 4, and 5. And the very, very lowest parts of the cord, down here, that's called the sacral region of the cord. And in between, we have the thoracic and lumbar portions of the spinal cord. So once again, here's the spinal cord, and here's the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral portions of the spinal cord. Now, the one thing we don't want to do is get confused between cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral portions of the spinal cord and the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral portions of the vertebral column, because these are not the same thing. So I'm going to quickly draw in a couple of vertebrae. And the immediate thing that we have to realize is that the vertebral column is far longer than the spinal cord. So these up here are cervical vertebrae. Let's say this is a cervical vertebrae. This would be a thoracic vertebrae. And let's say this is L1 vertebrae, and this is L2. And I did that on purpose because the spinal cord, containing all of the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral spinal levels ends at around the L2 vertebral level. Okay? So the spinal cord does not extend inferiorly all the way down to the end of the vertebral column, even though the spinal cord contains cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral spinal levels. So when you're in the lumbar region of the vertebral column, let's say right here, we've already reached the end of the cord, and so we're going to be talking about sacral portion of cord when we're in the lumbar region of the vertebral column. So I hope that's clear. And of course, when we're in the sacral portion of the vertebral column, there is no spinal cord to be found. What we do have is roots, okay, of the lower spinal nerves, which hang down apparently like the tail of a horse, okay, which is why this portion of the cord is called the cauda equina. So now we know that the location of the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies is within the spinal cord. And we also understand that the spinal cord itself only hangs down until the level of about L2 vertebral level. Now we're really going to nail down the location of the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies within the spinal cord. So as it turns out, within the cervical region of the spinal cord and within the sacral regions of the spinal cord, there are no preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies. It turns out that the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies are all located within a column which only extends between the thoracic portions and lumbar portions of the cord, which is why the sympathetic nervous system as a whole is sometimes also called the thoracolumbar system, because the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies are all located within the thoracic and lumbar portions of the cord. So, for example, if we, let's say, chopped the cord right at this level, we would not be cutting the cell bodies of any preganglionic sympathetic neurons, because all of the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies are located within the thoracolumbar spinal cord. So now, to really examine this precise location of these preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies, which we now know are within the central nervous system, and within the central nervous system they're located in the spinal cord, and within the spinal cord they're located specifically in the thoracolumbar regions of the spinal cord. Now we want to know within the thoracolumbar portions of the spinal cord, where are the cell bodies of the preganglionic sympathetics, and in order to do that we're going to have to take a cross-sectional view. So we're going to take the spinal cord and we're going to cut it somewhere in the thoracolumbar region, and we're going to look at a cross-section to find out exactly where the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies lie. So this is a cross-section of the spinal cord in the thoracolumbar region. So let's quickly identify the key features. Everything that's contained within this sort of butterfly shape, okay, this is called gray matter. And in general, what's in here is cell bodies. Okay? Everything outside, which is still covered in white, okay, that's called white matter. And in general, that's axons which are coming in or out of the spinal cord, or up and down the spinal cord. Now, anything behind this blue line here, that's called dorsal. And anything in front of that blue line is called ventral. Ventral means basically lying anteriorly and dorsal meaning lying posteriorly. So structures that are even further posterior to the spinal cord or dorsal to the spinal cord would be, of course, the spinous processes of all of the vertebrae. And something that's reliably ventral or anteriorly to the spinal cord is the actual body of all of the vertebrae. So let's say here is a vertebral body, and which will always be ventral to the spinal cord, and let's say here is a spinous process of that same vertebral bone. So the outermost boundaries of the gray matter, okay, which I'm sort of drawing over in blue, are sometimes called horns. Okay, so naturally, this portion of the cord here is the ventral horn. This is the ventral horn on the other side. And this portion of the cord here, and this portion as well, are called dorsal horns. Okay? So this is just a little bit of context on the basic structure of the spinal cord. This is the ventral horn. This is the dorsal horn, which are parts of the gray matter of the spinal cord. So here's a cross section of spinal cord, ventral horn, dorsal horn, and this whole butterfly here outlines the gray matter. In general, everything behind this line is dorsal, and everything in front is ventral. When we're talking about the gray matter of the spinal cord, ventral is synonymous with motor, and dorsal is synonymous with sensory. Okay, so located within the ventral horn of the spinal cord are motor neuron cell bodies, okay, which are going to pool their axons together to form what we call a ventral root. Okay? So this would be a ventral root exiting the spinal cord, and this contains the axons of motor neurons located in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So I'll label this thing here VR because this is a ventral root, and since it's a ventral root, we know that it contains axons of motor neurons which are located in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. And of course, if this is a ventral root, then naturally this here would be a dorsal root. And of course, anytime you call something a ventral root, you could refer to the same exact thing using the term anterior root, because anterior and ventral here are synonymous. And anytime you're talking about something being a dorsal root, you could also call it a posterior root, and you would mean the exact same thing. And just to be clear, another name for these motor neurons, which are located in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, is lower motor neurons. And what they do is they send their axons out in the ventral root, and these same exact axons end up synapsing directly on to skeletal muscle and form the classical neuromuscular junction. And so when these axons ultimately synapse onto skeletal muscle fibers, they release acetylcholine, and you get classical voluntary muscle contraction. Now, the dorsal root actually works a little bit differently because, number one, it's a sensory root, and so information, in other words, action potentials, typically travel back towards the central nervous system. But the other distinguishing feature about the dorsal root is that it's associated with this structure here, which is called the dorsal root ganglion. Now, the dorsal root ganglion contains lots and lots of sensory cell bodies which send their processes out towards the periphery like this. Here's one big sensory neuron, and it sends its extension out towards the periphery, and what this axon does out in the periphery is it detects sensory information of all different kinds, touch, pain, etc., and it relays that information back towards the central nervous system, ultimately through the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, after reaching the dorsal root ganglion, it'll go back into the dorsal root and then back into the central nervous system. So we'll go more into the structure of the spinal cord later, but we had to lay down this foundation so that we can understand specifically where the cell bodies of the preganglionic sympathetics are located. We know the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies are located in the central nervous system. We know that within the central nervous system they're located in the spinal cord. We know that within the spinal cord they're located specifically in the thoracolumbar regions of the spinal cord. And now we can finally understand in a cross-section of the thoracolumbar cord where exactly the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies are going to be. And that is in a place called the lateral horn. Okay? So before we talked about the lateral horn, we had to understand the dorsal horn, the ventral horn, and now we'll understand exactly what we're talking about when we say lateral horn of the spinal cord. Here's our cross-section somewhere within the thoracolumbar spinal cord. Here are the lower motor neuron cell bodies sitting in the ventral horn of the spinal cord on both sides. And here are their axons joining up to form a ventral root. Here is the dorsal root coming off of the dorsal horn, and it's going to run directly into the dorsal root ganglion, which contains the cell bodies of the primary sensory neurons. So it would only make sense that there is a structure here called the lateral horn of the spinal cord. So ventral horn, dorsal horn, lateral horn of the spinal cord. And of course, this lateral horn, okay, is where the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies are located, but only in the thoracolumbar portions of the spinal cord. In order to send their axons out towards the periphery, what these preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies do is they send their axons out along with the axons of the lower motor neurons, and they send their axons into the ventral root. Okay, this is the ventral root, which is carrying the axons of the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies. Okay, these are destined for a sympathetic ganglia where they can synapse onto postganglionic neurons, whereas these here are the axons of the lower motor neurons, which will not synapse. They will go directly to the neuromuscular junction. So here we have the dorsal root, which really only contains the axons of these cell bodies in the DRG, or dorsal root ganglia, which are sensory, whereas the ventral root contains axons of lower motor neurons as well as those of the preganglionic sympathetic neurons, which are located in the lateral horn of the spinal cord in the thoracolumbar portions. So let's try to understand in the last few minutes the three-dimensional location of the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies. Here we have sort of a cutaway three-dimensional version of the spinal cord from cervical, where we have a representative cervical cross-section here. Okay? Here is a representative cross-section of the thoracolumbar cord, and here is a representative cross-section of the sacral cord. In all portions of the spinal cord, we have gray matter, which is inside the butterfly, okay, here, here, and here, and we have white matter, which is outside of the gray matter. In all portions of the cord, we have ventral horns, okay, and inside of the ventral horn are the cell bodies of lower motor neurons, which are going to send their axons out in the ventral root and ultimately synapse directly onto muscle at a neuromuscular junction. At all levels, the dorsal horn sends out a dorsal root which connects to a dorsal root ganglion which has the cell bodies of sensory neurons, which directly, without synapsing, send their axons out to the periphery to detect sensory information like touch, pain, and temperature. But the only place you will find cell bodies of presynaptic sympathetic neurons is in the lateral horn, okay, of the thoracolumbar spinal cord. This lateral horn of the thoracolumbar spinal cord contains the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies which will send their axons into the ventral root along with those axons of the lower motor neurons and eventually send their axons out destined for synapses in sympathetic ganglia.